technology. So this is referring to your mobile phones, referring to your television, your tablets, computers, laptops, etc., things of that nature. And then in terms of IAD, PIU, this refers to internet addiction disorder, problematic internet use, and technology addiction. These are all terms that I'm going to be using synonymously today. There's some debate in this field as to should we be calling this an addiction, should we be calling this an impulse control disorder. I'm not going to get into that today, but just for the purposes of this presentation, I may be using other terms, just so you know I'm talking about the same thing. So I'll start with sort of how I got here, what made me interested in this. So if we go back 10 years, I had just graduated from CU, and up until that point, the way I was meeting people was through my classes and through partying. So I was a CU buff. And so I graduated, and all of a sudden I'm financially independent, and I don't have classes to connect with people. And when you're first financially independent, it's kind of hard to fund all the partying and live that lifestyle, especially when you're working at Starbucks for your income. So I didn't have a whole lot to do with my free time. That was sort of those were my interests. Those were my hobbies, was getting together with people. And so after that, I had to find something else that I could afford to do, yet I still felt like I wanted to do. And I had this roommate who played this game called Final Fantasy XI. And Final Fantasy XI is what's called an MMORPG. That's a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So for anyone that isn't sure, this is a giant fantasy world where at any time there's thousands of players. They're all over the world. You can talk to each other through this texting interface. Some people set up Skype accounts. They can talk to all these people while they're playing. But it's, you know, the object of the game is you're essentially running around killing monsters, and it costs $10 a month. And so there I was. And at first I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. That sounds you're a dork. And then it really helped level up my character. Like, And so there's this prompt in the game that you can type in that tells you how much you play the game. So in the first month, I type it in, and it's like, you played for 3 days and 9 hours and 20 minutes. And I'm like, oh, man. And a year and a half goes by, and I type that in, and it says, you played the game for 30 days, 4 hours, and 19 minutes. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I quantify a month as 30 days, and that was sort of the epiphany for me. All of a sudden, I was like, wow, I've spent a month of my life doing that. And it was just this really bizarre experience where I was just like, wow, if I could have that month back, I'd like to do something else with it. Yeah, hindsight's 20/20, right? So from this, I started to detach from this, but I also got a really great experience that I found so valuable, which is I learned about why people want to do this. It's fun, and you meet really fun people online. There's this whole culture about it. There's all these inside jokes, and there's a lot of clever people. A lot of them are really funny, and so you're in this community where you're wanted. You're finishing all these missions every day, so you're like feeling pretty good about yourself. You get some cool clothes in the game, so people are like, oh, that guy's done that mission, he's pretty cool, and that guy hasn't, he sucks. And so like you get to walk around and feel pretty good about yourself. So I became curious, and fast forward a couple years, and I started my career working for Mental Health Partners and then working at AIM House. And as I'm working at AIM House, that was the first time I ever heard of someone coming into treatment for technology addiction. And so we had this guy come in. Granted, all the other guys in the house, or many of them at least, were there because for drinking or some harder drug use. And this guy comes in, and real soft kid, silent kid, real nice, but he wasn't exactly shy, just didn't really want to talk to you. But he comes in, and the guys start sort of poking and prodding him. They're like, oh, so what are you here for? He says, I played World of Warcraft. This is another online virtual fantasy world game. And two or three of the guys, their eyes light up and start paying attention to this. And they go, oh, I played too. What's your character name? And he's like, oh, like Doombringer or something. And they're like, oh my God, you're Doombringer! And all of a sudden, these guys see this guy as a celebrity. And there's a moment where I feel really inadequate because I'm like, no one talked about my player. then there's this moment where I'm like, wow, like I played for that much time. Like I would sometimes put in 10 or 12-hour sessions. Saturday morning, you put a burrito and like, okay, like here we go. But how did this guy, how much time was he spending online that he ended up here? So again, this sort of fed my curiosity, and then years later I had an opportunity to write a thesis, and this became my topic. So I started looking at how this stuff is showing up in the news. Since doing my thesis, I've updated some of the news stories just for the purpose of telling the story. But this is one where, this is a selfie addict that attempted suicide after failing to take the perfect selfie. For anyone that doesn't know, a selfie is generally when you take a picture of yourself and you post it on an online social networking site, like Facebook. And so this guy took it upon himself to really have stringent criteria for what qualifies as what he's going to post. There's a Florida man who was charged with killing his son whose cry hindered his video game. So this gets into a concept that we often refer to as gamer rage, which I'll talk about later, but essentially when a lot of these games and technologies can activate a part of the brain that activates our appetitive drives, and when those are interrupted, the result can sometimes be rage, and unfortunately can sometimes have tragic consequences. China's web junkies. This is a screenshot from a documentary. It's like 8 or 10 minutes long, I think, but what it does is it looks at boot camps that are popping up in China that are funded by the government to treat people with video game addiction. Both China and South Korea have identified video game addiction as the #1 threat to their teens and children in their society. So it's not just here that we're starting to see a certain phenomenon arising. Over there, because the way the internet is distributed, they have large internet cafes called PC bangs, where I can go online, type this stuff in. It's wild. It's just a gigantic. It looks like a gymnasium just filled with computers, and you can get a cup of coffee or a Red Bull or something. Just people spend hours there. So it's not just here. This is an international thing that we're looking at. So I needed a framework for how I was going to look at this, and so I used the lenses of attachment, neurobiology, the effects of technology, and then I looked at prevalence statistics. I started with attachment because I wanted to get an idea of what is it that that sort of defines healthy development in people, and because technology offers this sense of constant connectedness, what effects might that be having on the individual? So throughout this, I've chosen a few quotes that I really like that I think set the stage for what I want to talk about. The first one's Alan Shore. Here he says, "The more the mother contingently tunes her activity level to the infant during periods of social engagement, the more she allows him to recover quietly in periods of disengagement. And the more she attends to his reinitiating cues for re-engagement, the more synchronized their interaction." So here's Shore starting to address the idea of right brain to right brain communication. This is the idea that human brains wire other human brains. And essentially, just the ability of a parent or caregiver interacting with their child and negotiating the child's cues for wanting to reconnect, you're providing all these opportunities for the child to go into distress and then learn to tolerate the distress and come back out of it and feel okay. So the more the caregiver can do this, the more opportunities there are for the child to learn to sort of get back on their feet. So John Bowlby was the pioneer of attachment, and from his research there came 4 basic attachment styles. The hallmark of attachment is considered the secure attachment style. These are people who often can move through the world with a sense of trust, not only in their environment, but in interpersonal relationships. He had 3 what were called insecure styles, including an avoidant style, an ambivalent style, and a disorganized style. The disorganized style being the most severe of the 4. And I'm not going to go into what each style is in the insecure types, but what's important to note from this is that none of these indicate any particular pathology. However, the insecure styles tend to lend themselves to relationship styles, interpersonal relationships that can become dysfunctional and lead to pathology. So that being said, someone who has an avoidant attachment style, an ambivalent attachment style, or even a disorganized style can still be an organized and functional member of society, depending on their ability to cope with other stressors in their life. So he took this a bit further and developed the idea of internal working models. Internal working models are sort of the idea of the procedural map we develop in terms of how we interact with other people based on what's happening around us. So these are things that develop over the course of our lifespan, but especially over earlier years and into teenage or young adulthood and adolescence. And so these goals change over the course of this time span. And so starting in infancy and toddlerhood, this is when the individual is learning how to utilize attachment behaviors. So an infant is laughing, crying, kicking, and then they're getting used to what it is that their caregiver does in response to this. And at this point, they're just trying to do what's called maintain optimal proximity. They want to keep the caregiver close. And at this point, as far as they're concerned, they're the center of the universe. The child cries, and all of a sudden this person comes and does something to help them. As far as they're concerned, it's that they're in this wonderful universe. Then around 2 years old, they start to develop more and more ways to become independent. They start crawling, walking, talking. And then they move into a stage that's referred to as the goal-corrected partnership. This is the idea that children eventually start to learn how to negotiate their own needs and the needs of their parents, because as they get their own independence, parents start to realize they had a life before they had this kid, and they start to get back to that. So whether it's returning to work or a hobby or a social group, there starts to become more and more periods of detachment, and the child starts to learn, okay, about how much of a certain behavior do I need to display to get this caregiver's attention. As we move into elementary school years, this is where the individual will start forming attachments with other adults. So at this point, the attachment goal is to develop a new attachment system aside from the caregiver. So this would include adults from other friends, families. This might include tutors or community leaders. But essentially, the child is starting to get the idea that there might be other people aside from caregivers who can provide a sense of security and reinforce that idea that they can get their needs met outside of just their caregiver. And we go to middle school, everyone's favorite awkward, confusing, weird. And at this point, the attachment system moves from parents and starts moving to their peers. So here, the youth is starting to move into a period of engaging in more intimate relationships with friends, possibly starting to embark on some sense of romance, but they're starting to interact with peers in a way that's new to them because they're starting to get needs met in different ways that aren't just playing. So this can be a hard goal for both parents and the kids, because essentially at this point, the kids are starting to detach. It's no longer that, lovable, like, teach me, help me, little kid. It becomes this, kid that starts getting an attitude and wanting a different haircut. And so at this point, while it's important for there to be a sense of the genesis of attachment, caregiver availability is still really important. So the idea that the caregiver can still be accessed in times of need, and that they're learning to regulate each other independently. So how much do I need to exhibit distress in order to get my needs met, but not overwhelm the other person. Finally, high school, everyone's favorite. This is when the attachment system starts to move almost exclusively to the social world. And the main goal here is to allow the teen to explore the social world. So at this point, it becomes more important than ever that the child be allowed to make decisions for themselves and experience the consequences of their decisions as a result of their choices. So while the adult is still providing a sense of structure and familiarity at home, the child is given increasing opportunities to get outside of the home and experience the world in ways that, again, are scary for both parties. But the idea is that there can still be that caregiver availability. There can still be a sense of checking in with the other party to communicate openly. Actually, if we look across research, one of the #1 protective factors for against mental disorders happens to be parent-child communication. So just this idea that I can communicate how I'm feeling or what I'm feeling and not be cast out or berated or abused for what I'm feeling is a really important concept to mental health. So onward to neurobiology. This is a quote from Lou Cozzolino's, one of Lou Cozzolino's books, where it says, "A mother reflexively holds her baby against her body after birth, maximizing skin contact and helping the infant's hypothalamus establish a set point for temperature regulation. The infant and mother gaze into each other's eyes, linking their hearts and brains." So here Cozzolino is taking that idea of right brain to right brain communication a step further. And he's talking about the attunement that happens just in contact. So especially in a child's early years, they don't have the opportunity to dissect the world through language or analytical terms, so they're doing it often through observational, interpretive, procedural, or somatic methods. So we've got two hemispheres in our brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere, being this emotional, procedural brain, turns on first. It's on for essentially the first 2 years of life. Around the second year of life, the left hemisphere comes online and starts ascribing language and more structural order to the world. And at this point, the child's starting to see and exhibit the world or entertain the world in a new way. But prior to that, there's a lot of programming that happens that, again, is just procedural in nature. And what's interesting about what Cozzolino's talking about here is that just by the skin-to-skin contact at an early time in the child's life, the child's brain is taking note of what's going on. It's paying attention to the heartbeat and the cadence of that person's life, or essentially basic life functions, and using that to calibrate its own system. So this is an individual, an infant that's new to the world, basically saying, I don't know how to calibrate, so I'm going to take this adult being's information and ascribe that as my own. So some of the things in right brain to right brain communication that I find are important to discuss, because they sometimes can, and oftentimes get lost in technological communication. The first concept would be prosody. And this is the idea of the tone and inflection that I use to communicate. So if I start saying, this is a tone and inflection I use to communicate, you just got the idea that I'm pretty excited about prosody. And you're more likely to remember that than had I just kept talking at the same pace. So there's a way that we use our voices and our expression to communicate different affective responses and communication non-verbally. So essentially, while I'm using my voice, it's not the words that matter. Furthermore, this idea of limbic resonance, this is the capacity to share deep emotional states. So the idea that always comes up for me when I hear limbic resonance is the Patriots opening game about 5 or 6 years ago. Tom Brady throws a pass, he's playing the Chiefs, and one of the defensive linemen falls on Brady's leg, and it goes that way. And anyone that's watching that is just going to cringe. It goes the opposite direction that knees are supposed to bend. This is the idea of limbic resonance. We can watch another person's experience and empathize with what it is they feel. So I've got a little clip here that, if this is going to be I'll play a short of Louis C.K. talking. He's provocative, so I'll bear that in mind as you watch it, but we'll only watch about a minute of it because I think he really hits home some of these
Some parents really struggle with, like, all the other kids have the terrible things, so my kid has to. Yeah, let your kid go and be a better example to the kids. Just because the other stupid kids have phones doesn't mean that, okay, well, my kid has to be stupid, otherwise she'll feel weird.
Right.
You know, I think these things are toxic. I don't, especially for kids. It's just this thing. It's bad, and
right.
they don't look at people when they talk to them, and they don't build the empathy. You know, kids are mean, and it's because they're trying it out. They look at a kid and they go, "You're fat," and then they see the kid's face scrunch up, and they go, "Ooh, that doesn't feel good to make a person do that." Right. But they got to start with doing the mean thing. But when they write "you're fat," then they just go, that was fun. I like that.
So if you can watch the rest of the clip, it's pretty funny. It's about 8 minutes long. He goes on about other stuff too that I think he hits home. But he's talking about an important concept there, and he's spot on. Kids at a young age, they don't know what the ends of their emotions always mean, so they're gonna test them, they're trying them out, and a caregiver is one of the most helpful things they can have to help them figure those things out. So in times of conflict, they're not left to the idea that, okay, I've done this thing to this kid, I'm experiencing distress, what do I do with this? A caregiver can come in and help sort of say, okay, you know, this is what you said, it looks like you upset your friend here, you know, what is it that you say? These are things that are necessary to help make that bridge, to help the child sort of develop the sense of empathy. The other thing he touches on there is just this idea of anonymity that exists online. Some interesting research that came out a few years ago, researchers wanted to study this idea and what they call toxic online behavior. So this is sort of the vitriolic comments that exist in online comment sections and online forums. So spend 10 minutes on Yahoo News and you get an idea what I'm talking about. But if you see this sort of stuff and essentially you just wonder where it comes from. And researchers looked into this. And what they did was they created a hypothetical situation where they paired participants. And they told them that they're going to need to come to an agreement on something. The situation is that you both have a relative or loved one who's really sick and there's no cure. But all of a sudden society comes up with this miracle cure, but there's only enough for one of your relatives to live. So you're going to have to come to an agreement as to whose relative is going to get it. So what they did was they looked at this across concepts including anonymity, visibility, and eye contact. And so they had the people sitting at computers typing to each other and figuring this stuff out. And the way they measured anonymity was that the other user would have some access to general demographics about you, like what you do for work, what part of town you live in, things like that. What they did for visibility was that they would have a camera trained on the profile of the person as they're typing so they could see like that sort of stuff. And then finally, for eye contact, they had a webcam that was just trained on the person's eyes. And what they found was that the number one variable that would reduce toxic online behavior during this conflict resolution was eye contact. So there's powerful stuff just going on in the mutual exchanges we share when we look each other in the eye. So the things I've got listed up here, these are areas of the brain that have been implicated in video game addiction research. And if you're familiar with addiction research, then you should recognize all of these areas. So we're seeing a lot of the same areas come up in technology addictions as we are seeing in substance abuse. Furthermore, we see that dopamine system's getting involved. Dopamine is, for anyone that doesn't know, it's a neurotransmitter in the brain that's often correlated with pleasure. It's often involved in our ability to seek out things that we want. It helps us sort of feed appetitive drives. And also too much of it can be a bad thing. It's often correlated in more severe mental health diagnoses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. But what we see in the technology addiction research is an increased level of dopamine receptors and a decreased number of dopamine transporters. So what this is suggesting is tolerance. Essentially the brain's responding to an increase in dopamine and it's making adjustments to try to learn how to tolerate the dopamine floods that are coming in. So while there hasn't been any causal research saying that internet addiction is doing this, we're seeing the same things there. So we're seeing a lot of similar trends. Furthermore, we're seeing increased cue sensitivity. Cue sensitivity is the idea that someone who's addicted to a video game can look at a screen shot of World of Warcraft and immediately the parts of their brain that start going into planning, craving, etc. are going to turn on, activate, be like, oh, let's get to playing. So we're seeing an increased cue sensitivity in this population as well. And why this is something to really pay attention to is that cue sensitivity is something that can amplify and expand. So while someone's sitting at their laptop or computer in their basement playing video games, it may not just be the video games that are being the cues that are getting anchored to. It can be things like just a laptop. It can be the keyboard, the sound of the keys. you know, the Kool-Aid that you're drinking because, you know, it's cheap and easy and makes your water taste good. But any of these things can sort of, the more things that get tied to this behavior, then the more cues there are that sort of elicit craving. Finally, this is a quote from Lewis Amini and Lannon's book, A General Theory of Love. And they say, "A child's electronic stewards, television, videos, computer games, are the emotional equivalent of brand. They occupy attention and mental space without nourishing. An ironic revelation of the television computer age is that what people want from machines is humanity, stories, contact, and interaction." So here, I think they're really hitting home an important concept. Is that kids are often being given technology at this time as a distraction, as sort of a coping skill. When the brain often needs downtime, one, to help it consolidate information in which it's learned earlier. So just the idea of having downtime can be really helpful for the brain. But furthermore, the more that they're given tablets and other technologies, the less opportunities they have to learn to regulate things like boredom. And what's underneath boredom? Well, it might be restlessness. It might be the fear about the people sitting around me. It could be a ton of things. But there, again, this idea that there's an opportunity that's lost when they go to these, rather than having an opportunity to learn how to deal with what feelings are coming up and regulate. So I looked at prevalence rates through a study called 0 to 8. This was done by Common Sense Media. The initial research was done in 2011. They're now making this a biannual study. It involves it's responses from parents involving about 1,600 kids between the ages of 0 to 8. And what they found in 2013 is that 17% of those surveyed use a mobile device daily. And this is twice as many as there were when they surveyed in 2011. So we're seeing an increase in kids that are using mobile devices daily. Additionally, the average time spent on a mobile device is a little over an hour, and this was a 25-minute increase over the last 2 years. Something I didn't list on here was the number of households in which a tablet is present quadrupled in the last 2 years as well. So we're seeing a lot more access to mobile technologies in general. So I do think this is something worth considering looking forward. So this brings me to my research. So I did a small qualitative study where I interviewed 4 clinicians who are working with young men in treatment center that are struggling with technology addiction, mainly video game addictions. And then I also talked to 2 young men who had completed treatment from technology or video game addiction. And so from that, I read over my transcripts and extracted themes that I think are helping in sort of conceptualizing what may be going on in some of these clients' lives in severe cases. The first one was the idea that there's an undermining of the goal-corrected partnership. Technology's constant connectedness can increase or decrease parent-child communication, and therefore impact the ability to learn, for either party to learn how to regulate. So this was a quote from one of the treatment participants. He was talking about his mother. He said, "Like every time we got in the car, it was just like I couldn't have a conversation with her while riding in the car because she was talking to someone on her phone." So Sherry Turkle, a professor at MIT, talks about this a lot, that there's this strange thing that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years where we can just be talking and then all of a sudden just start doing this. And it's bizarre just in the sense that all of a sudden we've started interrupting conversations for who knows what. The thing is, you're probably making a guess as to what I'm doing on here. I could be talking with a friend, I could be playing a game, I could be looking at porn. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is people are just starting to check out of conversations and check in with something else because there's always something else you can access. Isolation was a really common theme that you see in this population. Online communities provide a refuge against exploring in-person social interactions, And because this population usually has fewer friends, there's fewer opportunities to practice interpersonal relationships. So one of the clinicians said a very high percentage of these kids were bullied, so I think a lot of the time parents were okay with the amount of gaming. So I often refer to this as this concept of the lesser evil. Video games are often the lesser evil, because if the kids in my basement playing video games, they aren't doing drugs, they aren't having unprotected sex, they aren't getting bullied. There's a whole lot of things that we're often told are much worse. So if they're doing this, it's okay. When really the kid also isn't making any friends, and as a result of this, maybe missing out on other important opportunities or opportunities for growth. So this was another common theme that was seen. Helicopter parenting is the idea of always having to do something for the child rather than allowing the child to experience the distress and maybe helping them with that distress, helping them regulate through that distress. Two of the the clinicians that I interviewed discussed helicopter parents. It was also implied by one of the treatment participants who said, "My mom sort of hovered over the top of me, tried to make sure I was doing everything right." So again, this gets back to the idea of mutual co-regulation and allowing the child to experience distress and help the child come back from that distress. So here he was saying that instead of his mother allowing him to screw up every now and then, she would step in to sort of say, "Hey, well, here's how you do it." So you've got this guy who doesn't have a whole lot of confidence to try things out. And then finally, there's this idea of tech-focused relationships. So at a young age, technology use is often encouraged. And one of the clinicians here noted, parents sometimes just admire their kids, and kids are much smarter than the parents are about the technology. Parents rely on their kids to help them out with technology, and the kid is the authority, and the parents admire that. So at a young age, kids are often encouraged to start using technology. It's seen as this ladder in a lot of ways, that if you can use technology efficiently, you can really get a lottery ticket. You know, the guys that made Snapchat, or Mark Zuckerberg who made Facebook in his dorm room, like, you can really strike it rich, be successful. It's an important part of society today. That being said, as these kids get older, their parents start to notice something such as like their lives aren't panning out the way they may have imagined their kid's life turning out. So parents start to restrict technology use. And all of a sudden this activity where they were receiving praise and validation becomes this point of contention. And so one of the clinicians referred to this as the vicious cycle. And so it starts with a parent restricting technology use as a result of, okay, my kid, he's not hanging out with his friends, he's 14 and he's just sitting in the basement, and tell him he can't play games anymore, he can't spend time online anymore, he's got to do something else. Doesn't necessarily have those skills, he wasn't practicing them for the last 4 years. So what does the kid do? He's going to find a way around them. So the kid might ask the other parent for permission, might go to a friend's house, play games at school, or sneak down, play the games at night. One of the clients said it would really be difficult to sneak downstairs. I had to learn like all the spots in the floorboards. So he went on to talk about doing his best impersonation of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Xbox. Going down, and he'd sneak down at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and he talked about how common it was for his parents to come downstairs getting ready for work, and he's like got a Cheetos beard and been playing Call of Duty all night. So inevitably what happens next is the parents start to resent their child or teen for breaking these rules. So at that point, more rules are enforced and this cycle just sort of gets ramped up. So beyond these findings, I just in my time working with this population and working with young adults, there's been a lot of themes that I've noticed that just sort of come up and that I found helpful that I wanted to share as well. So first, the comorbid diagnoses and diagnoses where there may be higher risk. Dmitry Christakis looked at 224 individuals, and he found that depression to be one of the highest risk diagnoses. He found that in cases of moderate to severe depression, these people were 24 times more likely to experience problematic internet use. in cases of social anxiety, Jenkins, Guarnari et al. Found that fear of rejection was commonly associated with greater intensity of Facebook use. So because these clients don't want to go out and try out new interactions, they instead go online and try to manage their relationships through Facebook. Then these last four, I don't have research for. I haven't done the legwork to see if it's out there, but in cases of PTSD, when I did an internship at the VA a few years ago, we saw a phenomenon where a lot of veterans are spending their days playing something like Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And it's one of the great disservices I think we do to our veterans, that we train them for warfare, but we don't train them to come back into society. So if they're ill-equipped, if they've experienced incredible traumas like those that they oftentimes have, they're coming back into the world and feeling like they need to essentially ramp up their autonomic nervous system to feel normal. So you can't do that just bagging groceries. So eventually they're going to find something that does it for them, and using something like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, they can sort of get themselves back into that action-oriented mode where the game itself may be re-traumatizing them on some level, but because it's so familiar, it feels better than nothing. ADHD, because these are clients that are often 5 steps ahead of the first cohesive thought that they have, the internet offers them great assurances that the internet can keep up with how fast they're thinking. So what starts with doing research on Greece turns into looking at the Greek islands, which turns into looking at islands, which looks into Hawaii, which looks into plane tickets to Hawaii, which turns into I'm buying a ticket to Hawaii, which turns out I'm in Hawaii. This happened. This is great. So you can do that online, and so there's a big draw, and for so many of these clients, executive functioning is severely impacted. So the ability to lay out a plan and follow a plan can be one of the greatest things they can do for themselves to learn to cope with this. And the internet often isn't easy to do that because it offers so many alternatives. International students, this was something that came as a surprise to me. This is something I've seen at CU, where we've got students coming here, having earned degrees in a foreign country, and coming to learn English and then integrate into the university setting here. So they'll use Skype or something like that to communicate with folks back home. And if they're having problems acculturating to the US, those Skype conversations tend to increase. And as those tend to increase, isolation tends to increase. And as isolation tends to increase, depression tends to increase. So for someone who's having trouble acclimating, technology can afford an easy out that sure, it's awfully understandable and it can have ramifications. And then finally, folks who fall on the autism spectrum, because interpersonal relationships can be so difficult, identifying emotions can be so difficult, there's an increased sensitivity to sensations in general in some of this population. Because of all these factors, the internet can often afford solace and refuge from some of the distress coping with this disorder can provide, and it can become a very repetitive and ritualistic behavior. So if you're going to assess for this, what are the things that you're looking for? The first one off the bat is just isolation. This is a population that tends to isolate often, and how much are they isolating is something to look at. Is there time distortion? Are you sitting down to play the game for an hour and then finding out it's 6 hours later and you haven't completed your homework, or you haven't picked your son up from school? Has something else happened, or are you playing it at risk of other obligations? Then there's this idea of the Tetris effect, and I think this is one of the most interesting things when I look at all this research. The Tetris effect is this phenomenon that emerged in, I believe, the late 90s. And what they found was that people who were playing a lot of Tetris, which is a puzzle game, were having dreams of the puzzle pieces in their sleep. So they play this game for a few hours and then they start dreaming about it. And I myself can attest to having Dr. Mario dreams. I played with my wife a couple times. But she beats me. But, So there's this idea that all of a sudden these games start invading your dreams. But where this gets so interesting was scientists looked at, I believe it's referred to as integrative amnesia. So these are people who can't form new thoughts. They found a group of people who have integrative amnesia and had them start playing Tetris. And what they found is they were still having these dreams. So in this population where people can't create new thoughts, it's still somehow getting through the filter into the unconscious and incorporating itself into their dream states. So if this is happening in Tetris, I'm extrapolating, but I'm wondering what's happening in games where people are playing games, like first-person shooters, or they're playing fantasy games, or things to this nature. More research is certainly required before we can make any sort of causal correlations there, but I think it's certainly something to think about. And finally, well, not finally, but also withdrawal. Are we seeing cases of withdrawal when the technology is removed? Withdrawal would look like irritability, anger, frustration, difficulty tolerating relationships when they don't have the technology to help them regulate. And then, again, this idea of gamer rage. So, gamer rage has to do with an extreme violent response that's often seen when a video game or technology is removed from an individual who's addicted to using it in some form or fashion. So we all have these seeking systems in our brain. This is also often referred to as the brain reward pathway. So it's the idea that we seek pleasurable experiences and the brain rewards us for it. They give us a little hit of dopamine that feels good. The reason why our brain would want to do this is because a long time ago we needed to find resources and we needed to self-stimulate to find these resources. So we get rewarded for things like food and sex and shelter. And our brain actually rewards us for that. But it goes further than that. There's not just the seeking or the consummation of resources, there's also the seeking of the resources. So essentially the hunt. We get rewarded for that too. So the part of the brain that's interpreting pleasure and rewarding us for finding things that are pleasurable is also rewarding us for looking for pleasurable things. And again, this was important because you have to go out and find a mate. The gazelle isn't just going to come to you. You got to go out and get it. So what happens across species when we interrupt this process is that we see these rageful reactions. On some level, we had to learn to react because it may have threatened our survival. And so we still utilize this system in the brain. However, now we use it for different things. And because things are more obtainable, because I can go to the grocery store and get groceries instead of having to go capture wildebeest, now the seeking system can start working on other things. So essentially it can become attached to other objects. And I've got a short video here that I'm going to fast forward to the middle of it. And but the premise of it is that this is two people. It's a woman whose partner plays a whole lot of video games, and she's upset with him because he thinks he's going to spend that evening what's called raiding. That's when you go online and play the game for 6 or 8 hours trying to collect these little items or quests. So what she does is she goes and deletes his account. And what we'll watch is sort of his reaction to this. Maybe. We'll watch his reaction. Okay, so he's just arrived. And again, seeking system activated. We're looking at ritualistic behaviors. He's sitting in front of the computer. He's got his pack of smokes in his hand. He's getting ready to log in. And the thing I see interesting is he starts logging in. He's typing. And he's getting activated because he puts a cigarette in his mouth. Why? He's getting ready to really get his brain stimulated. So now something's wrong. And I should warn you, there's some profanity in this.
What the?
So my intention in this isn't to be scaremongering, but I do want people to be aware that this is a possibility. The story I showed you earlier, the child who was killed by his father who interrupted his game, is something I think we should all be concerned about for people who have children or who have relationships that are potentially risky. When I first watched this video, I think I had the same reaction as you, and then after watching it a couple other times, I started to wonder if that woman's okay. It's scary when it becomes something that can be disactivating for people.
Dave, can I ask a question? Is there any data about whether the people who show this kind of rage have shown potential for that kind of rage outside of the technology?
That's a great question. I don't know that answer. Yeah. So how do we treat this population? First and foremost, I think motivational interviewing is the best place to start. If they don't think there's a problem, I don't know that you're going to get anywhere. And anyone that's worked with addictions is going to know that you've got to treat the addiction as well as the other disorder simultaneously. And then I think starting with harm reduction is a great place to start. Just the idea of how can you control this? How can you put parameters around it so that you're doing the things in your life that are important to you. Starting with something like a technology fast is a way for a client to just sort of get an idea of what this looks like. So this would be, can you spend this weekend only using your cell phone for phone calls, and no texting, stay off your email. And if this is someone that you think is sort of would be higher risk or is going to have a harder time doing this, you might ask them to develop a journal to chart this, or to say, like, if you're going to use technology, at least write down what's going on before you use it. And the idea there is you're at least maybe even unconsciously suggesting that you have the ability to do something else. Even if you're just writing in your journal first, you can at least process with them the idea that how were you able to do something else first. Just interrupting that idea that they're driven by their compulsions. Furthermore, creating something like a no technology zone or a no technology day. I think this is something that can be helpful with families in which technology is sort of entrenched or ingrained in the family system. I don't always, I've had, since doing this research, I've had a lot of parents ask me, so what do I do? My kid, they'll start crying if they take the phone away. And, I don't know, the answer is just taking it away and saying, like, ha ha ha, figure it out. I think it does need to be introduced in a way of, like, we're trying to make a shift in the way that we do things where relationships are number one. And just starting around creating what I would call a sacred space where relationships can be at the forefront. Cold Turkey is a program that people can install on their computers. It's, I would describe it as like a gatekeeping program. Essentially, you would tell Cold Turkey, I only want to use Facebook for 2 hours on weeknights between 5 and 7 p.m. And then what Cold Turkey does is it makes it so you can't open Facebook any other hours outside of that. And it also prevents itself from being uninstalled through multiple means. So the designers had that in mind, that as people started to do this, they were going to be like, you know what, I didn't really mean it. Sorry, Cold Turkey. Like, I'm done. It's been real. So that's one way that clients might find helpful if they just want something to help put some boundaries in. Reddit NoFap. For those that don't know, FAP is internet slang for masturbation. And I consciously chose not to talk about online pornography today because I feel like that's a presentation all to itself. Online pornography use is a major thing that's emerging in young people in our country. It's becoming incredibly easily accessed. And so Reddit NoFap is an online community of men primarily men, who found that they were having trouble getting aroused in romantic relationships. They're having trouble finding romantic relationships, interacting with in their romantic relationships, but essentially their online pornography use had become very interruptive in their lives. Erectile dysfunction is another common side effect of this population seeing. But what happened was there was just sort of this online movement where people started getting together on Reddit, which is an online forum site where people track a ton of different things. But they started this community where they started saying, I'm not using online pornography. It's this online support group where people are just saying, hey, I'm not doing this. It's been 30 days since I've looked at online pornography, and here's what's happening to me. And the success stories are really, really encouraging. I highly recommend at some point, if you got 5 minutes, just go on there and read what people are saying, because they're not just having success in romantic relationships. People are finding that they have time for things they never knew they were interested in to begin with. So all of a sudden, they're trying out all these new activities, they're trying out these new hobbies, new interests, they're getting into things differently. And it's changing people's lives, which I find remarkable for a community that just wanted to stop masturbating and needed to help being held accountable. So finally, if none of this stuff is working, higher care may be necessary. And I've listed these just in sense of most extreme to more community-oriented. So Restart is a intensive inpatient treatment in Washington State. It's a treatment program for people who identify with a technology or video game addiction. They serve exclusively this population. They practice a lot of things. They develop a lot of new skills and are free from technology for about, I think it's like 45 days before they start reintroducing it. Beyond that, we've got collegiate coaching services, which happens to be in our backyard. There's a few people here tonight that work for collegiate coaching services. You guys want to raise your hands real quick so people can look around and see who is who. So collegiate coaching services works with young adults in the community, and their bread and butter is technology addiction. They do a lot of this stuff too, and they're in the trenches every day. So if you want to hear more